Sorry. Thank you so much. So again, my name is Sierra Dudley. I am one team member of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, here with you today to present some initial findings from the Berkeley Upzoning report. This report aims to address the impacts of upzoning in light of the resolution in March to densify and upzone single-family home areas in Berkeley. So in addition to getting deep into some research about impacts of such upzoning, we also want to research and recommend ways to continue to support tenants who are vulnerable to displacement in Berkeley, and also continue to provide a wealth of affordable housing. So a little bit of background on who we are. The Anti-Eviction Mapping Project is a data visualization, critical cartography, and multimedia collective. We study and visualize entanglements of housing policy, race, class, and political economy, especially in the San Francisco Bay Areas, Los Angeles, and New York City. Among many other things, we produce digital maps, tools, softwares, reports, and other kinds of media. Specifically, we've published several different reports based in the San Francisco Bay Area that document and visualize evictions, rent control, and displacement, among many other topics. And these reports have informed policy and movement building at grassroots and governmental levels. Our process brings together a pretty interdisciplinary team of folks. On this project, there are professional researchers, data analysts, and critical cartographers. This next slide is just an overview bio of everybody working on this project. Today you're going to be hearing from me. I am a researcher and critical cartographer, specializes in geospatial analysis. You'll also be hearing from Alex Farrer, who is a housing researcher and data analyst, and he's also part of the data side and mapping side. From the research side, you'll be hearing from Amy Lee, who is an instructor at UC Berkeley and also a researcher of displacement and gentrification in the context of Chinatowns. So just an overview of what we'll be showing today. We'll really be sharing initial findings from each component part of this report, with a broad intro about upzoning. We're going to be following that with some findings from a sociodemographic profile of Berkeley that we're building. We're also going to be showing a prototype of the Berkeley Vulnerability Index, followed by some case study research about upzoning in and outside of Berkeley. And finally, we're really excited to hear your feedback and also hear any insights you have about the direction of this report as we continue on in the following months. So just to ground us as we move forward, as I mentioned, this report is a response to the Berkeley City Council passing a resolution to end single-family zoning by 2022, and of course this was in March, with the aim to densify housing. And this quote from the mayor, I think, really encapsulates the pervasive attitude of people who are proponents of rezoning residential areas. Their main claim being that rezoning as a policy inherently reduces rents and leads to less displacement, and ends experiences of homelessness. A main aim of our report is to really understand the validity of this argument through research case studies and digging into some local data about Berkeley to understand what kinds of impacts zoning can have and what the potential dangers of displacement are. So just a broad step back, what is upzoning? Upzoning encompasses any zoning change that increases the density or the utility of a parcel's land. And of course, right now in Berkeley, the big topic of upzoning relates to the densification of formerly single-family home-zoned areas. But there are lots of different kinds of upzoning policies that we'll be talking about some of today, with the aim really to show that there are lots of different kinds of zonings that can happen in one city, and to kind of explore the impacts of all of these. One of the main debates around upzoning is folks who are proponents of it and really support upzoning policies as market solutions imply that it, as a solution, upzoning is inherently equitable, and that it will reverse the impact of redlining and zoning for single-family homes, which are both policies that have embedded racist histories in Berkeley and other cities. But they see that solution as inherently reversing these racist legacies without necessarily offering other kinds of solutions that protect vulnerable residents. The concern that we have and are continuing to research is that upzoning will in fact accelerate displacement, especially of Black, Brown, and low-income residents in Berkeley. And this paradoxically intensifies the racist impacts of these land use policies. As we dig into the theoretical ideas of upzoning, we are very grounded by the reality of housing in Berkeley and the need to have more affordable housing. And I look to this visualization and table of the 2020 RENA allocation progress report in Berkeley. And of course, this is passed, and Berkeley now needs to build 9,000 new units by 2030. But I'd like to point to the remaining units and the lack of affordable units that were built by 2020, right? There's still over 500 units that Berkeley needed to build of low and very low AMI units. Meanwhile, the report shows that 177% of the above moderate units were built already. So this very real statistic is grounding for us in this report because we do think to how upzoning policies could help us achieve those 500 units that we need, and we really question that and think about what kinds of protections and new policies will help us get to that affordability. I'd like to shift, before we talk into policies and research, I'd like to shift into the findings from the socio-demographic profile that we're building. This profile, in broad strokes, covers several demographic and social data sets from the US Census. And our hope here is that it can help us build an understanding of who lives in Berkeley and what the status of the housing market is. And so we've looked at data over time between 2009 to 2019. And in the following findings, we're going to show you kind of how those data sets have changed over time. So we're looking specifically at data from the American Community Survey and the 5-year estimates from 2009, 2014, and 2019. We chose this data and are looking at it at a census tract level to maximize accuracy in our research. And additionally, the 5-year estimates that we've chosen from 2009, 2014, and 2019 are aggregates of a 5-year period. And so the data that we're going to be looking at today is percent of renter occupancy, median gross rent, median home value, percent of rent burden households, percent of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, percent of white population, percent Latinx population, and percent population experiencing poverty, as well as median household income. We chose these different demographics very explicitly, as many of them, changes and patterns in these can also indicate patterns of displacement and gentrification. And so as we go into considerations about upzoning in Berkeley, we'd like to understand the previous patterns of these specific demographics. And so the following presentation you're going to see in this section will show map visualizations. And in these maps, you're going to see data changes over time between 2009 to 2019. And we're hoping that the map format can help us call out some hotspots and big neighborhood changes that we're seeing. So first, I want to start by looking close into race and ethnicity and these changes over time. Firstly, this map indicates the change in Black, Indigenous, and people of color populations, residents in Berkeley from 2009 to 2019. So this average change in the city of Berkeley during this time period was an increase of 13.29%. And we do see these increases spread around different census tracts in Berkeley, but we see quite an extreme decrease in West Berkeley, and this is in districts 1 and 2, and this decrease was 31%. And I'd like to call that out very specifically. In the corner on the right here, you can see that I've indicated Berkeley Council districts overlaid over the census tracts that we're looking at for a little bit of context, because I know the census tracts are not a familiar way necessarily to break down Berkeley neighborhoods. I'd like to next look at Latinx populations and the percent change over time. The average change in the city of Berkeley was an increase in 9.16%. And again, we can see an increase across Berkeley, with the highest increase over this time being 10% in census tracts kind of around the city. We do see, again, decreases concentrated in south of campus areas and Southeast Berkeley and West Berkeley. This map of changes in population of white population are, as expected, the opposite of BIPOC populations. So the average change in the city of Berkeley was a decrease in white populations of negative 7.59%. And there are a cluster of increases through Southwest Berkeley, again, in districts 2 and 3. And the most extreme increases of white populations happened in West Berkeley. I'd like to next turn to income, rent burden, and poverty level over time. This map indicates changes in median income over time. The average change in median income in the city of Berkeley was almost $27,000 over this time period. There are some large increases, again, in West Berkeley, also seen in North Berkeley and Southeast Berkeley. These were increases of $38,000 to $56,000, almost $57,000. There are lower increases around the campus area, and in part we attribute these to student populations. I'd also like to call out here that although we see very extreme increases in certain areas, that doesn't necessarily mean that those areas currently have the highest median income. Those statistics we are also going to be visualizing in the report themselves, but these findings are just showing change over time. We're next going to look at poverty rate. For this map, we're using metrics of poverty rate as defined by the American Census, by the U.S. Census. And so their metric for poverty is related to their own income threshold. And I recognize that there are lots of different important ways to calculate poverty, but for this case, we are utilizing the U.S. Census statistics. So over time, we see an increase in poverty rate by almost 2%. This is concentrated. We see some actually decreases in poverty rate in North Berkeley and in West Berkeley again, whereas we see some increases in the poverty rate over time kind of throughout the Berkeley area, but especially in the area between districts 2 and 3. Next, we're looking at rent burden, and this is, of course, residents who are rent burdened pay at least 30% of their income on rent. There's an average increase in tenants who are experiencing rent burden in Berkeley over time, and that is an increase of 1.81%. We see extreme decreases in rent burden populations in West Berkeley, and we see some increases in rent burden populations around UC Berkeley and around North Berkeley. The rent burden population experience could also be attributed to students, but nonetheless, it's an important thing to look at around the campus area. Next, I'm going to be quickly going through some data about rent, tenure, and home value. Median monthly rent, including utilities, had an average change over time in the city of Berkeley of $600 per month. So on average, between 2009 and 2019, the rent increased by $600 a month for tenants. which is pretty intense. I'd like to call a very sharp increase in West Berkeley, districts 1 and 2, of over $1,800 increase per month, which is very extreme. Although we do see, as we would all expect, a general increase in rents over time. This map looks at renter occupancy and the percent change in renter occupancy over time. So the average change in renter occupancy in Berkeley increased, so there are higher numbers of renters in general across Berkeley, so that increased by almost 4%. Something interesting we're seeing is an average decrease in rentership near UC Berkeley and near the campus area of 0 to 4%, and directly above the campus, we also see a decrease of between 4 to 13%, which is pretty extreme and surprising considering that is a very high rentership area historically. Likewise, we see an increase in rentership in West Berkeley, South Berkeley, and in some parts of District 5 and North District 6. Finally, we're looking at median home value. This is a key metric that where we try to understand how value changes over time. So on average, the change in median home value in Berkeley increased by $285,000. Which is quite high. The highest increase was in Southeast Berkeley of an increase of almost $740,000. And we see clusters of higher than average increases also in Southwest and North Berkeley. With that, I am going to hand it over to my colleague Alex, who's going to discuss the Berkeley Vulnerability Index.
All right, thank you, Sierra. So we have created a policy kind of evaluation framework here in the Berkeley Vulnerability Index, which will evaluate the relative threat of displacement facing residents of each census tract in Berkeley by analyzing 8 predictive metrics, which we'll get into in a minute. This has been derived from a similar methodology developed in Los Angeles. It's been used in publications, including the one listed here by Strategic Actions for a Just Economy, and is used by the Los Angeles County Development Authority. Not the same exact method, but a similar methodology. The metrics are chosen from established predictors of displacement risk in the academic literature, substantiated by empirical work, and we conducted an extensive literature review of similar efforts and tools to inform the selection, ensuring that only metrics with clear links to displacement risk were chosen. And we highlight tracts with large student populations, which may necessitate independent consideration in policymaking. Next slide, please. So we analyzed the performance of Berkeley census tracts across these 8 indicators. The data comes from the 2019 ACS 5-year survey, American Community Survey, the same data that was presented in just a minute ago by Sierra. These are the proportion of renters who are cost burdened, the proportion of owners who are cost burdened, the proportion of renters which are non-white, the median household income, the proportion of renters unemployed, the proportion of units which are overcrowded, and the proportion of renters which have been occupying their units for a period of 15 years or longer. The performance of each census tract is compared to the citywide average for Berkeley. If it differs in the direction indicating vulnerability, the tract is scored with a 1 on this metric. So for example, if there are 60% Berkeley residents are renters and 65% in a particular tract are renters, then the tract will score 1 on that metric. Indicators are then summed to reflect the dimensions of vulnerability which are present in each tract. So if 7 are present, the tract will receive a 7. Next slide. It's important to remember that this is a relative measure, so it compares tracts within Berkeley to Berkeley as a whole. So what it does is that it establishes which parts of Berkeley are more or less likely to see resident displacement under conditions of redevelopment within the context of the city itself. This can help establish recommendations for targeting of any potential upzoning that might occur. It can also help highlight areas that are important to this board's work and may require additional consideration for tenant protections or preservation of rent-stabilized housing. At later stages, we'd like to evaluate the relative likelihood that upzoning will result in new development across Berkeley neighborhoods using the same tool and combined with some property level data. Next slide, please. So here is the preliminary findings, which will be produced in the report. These are the Berkeley census tracts, which we've just been looking at, mapped according to the vulnerability analysis in this tool. And so, as you can see, it ranges from 7 degrees of vulnerability to 0 degrees of vulnerability. There's one tract in Northeast Berkeley, directly north of campus in the hills, which has 0 indicators of vulnerability, and a couple tracts in South Berkeley and directly adjacent to the campus, as well as one tract in downtown, which have 7 degrees of vulnerability. As you can see, despite the fact that the student population is concentrated around campus, there are some heightened areas of vulnerability in the South Side and downtown regions, which are a particular concern because the student population is not removed from the original calculation made for the citywide averages, so these areas are disproportionately vulnerable to displacement, even with the context of students being included in the Berkeley population. Thanks, Sarah. So just to represent these findings, vulnerability is concentrated in South-Southwest and West Berkeley, adjacent portions of the city, in addition to areas which are populated by students next to the university. Special attention should be given to those census tracts which were highlighted in the yellow hash. Those were the places with student populations greater than 30%, as the student population in those tracts is, to a large degree, the reason for the vulnerability there. Census tracts in South and West Berkeley, which I highlighted, that do not have those high student populations, are still demonstrating concerning levels of vulnerability. In the southeast and northern parts of Berkeley, there is less vulnerability, though of course that doesn't mean no vulnerability, it's just lower than average for Berkeley. And so we would like to take in next steps as we continue to develop this report to produce estimates of vulnerability that incorporate the same indicators or as many as are possible, but excluding student populations, to provide a second look that can be used to complement this. So we'll look at producing a version with the average for the citywide calculated without the use of the student population, so that it should highlight additional vulnerability in non-student tracts. We'll also look at producing a map that simulates the effects of removing the students altogether to try to get at baseline vulnerability in those tracts where students do exist. We're also looking to complete a parcel level analysis based on the physical characteristics of each individual parcel in the city, as well as tract level demographic and economic conditions that will predict which parcels are more likely to be targeted for redevelopment in light of new upzoning policies. The effect to which will be to overlay that map with this map in a combined indicator that would call attention to places that would be a concern for the reason of likely redevelopment and vulnerability. And so some questions that will be retread kind of at the end here. Are there key indicators of interest to the board? Does this reflect the board's understanding of Berkeley dynamics? And does the board have preferences in dealing with the student population and data visualization? And I think that's all from me. Thank you, Sierra. I'll pass it over to Amy.
Thanks, Alex. I'm Amy, and I will be presenting our literature review on upzoning and some case studies from New York and other cities. Next slide, please. Thanks. As a part of our research, we conducted a literature review on upzoning, paying close attention to the literature on California and the Bay Area. Reports from the Turner Center for Housing Innovation are widely cited by politicians, city planners, and other advocates of upzoning to make a case to build more density by easing regulatory processes and incentivizing private developers. The review of the academic literature has shown that much of the enthusiasm for upzoning is based on inference rather than on actual evidence that shows how upzoning has benefited communities while creating more density. The research shows there is a strong correlation between strict zoning controls and lower affordability. Based on this correlation, advocates of upzoning infer that upzoning would increase affordability and construction. Very little literature actually looks at how zoning changes have impacted housing affordability and displacement. Part of the reason for this is that large-scale upzoning is a relatively new policy measure adopted by cities and states. We have still to find out what the effects of these measures will be. The Turner Center proposes many policies that will help ease barriers to development while recognizing the importance of anti-displacement measures and tenant protection. However, much of the focus remains on creating feasible models that would appeal to private developers. Indeed, many proponents of upzoning today recognize the importance of centering racial equity. Research institutes such as the Othering and Belonging Institute, also here in Berkeley, and the NYU Furman Center and Pratt Center for Community Development in New York City are studying policies that complement upzoning, inclusionary housing, and racial desegregation. Our focus in this report, however, will be on evaluations of real-world impacts of upzoning and not solely on theoretical models. Next slide, please. On this slide, I chart an overview of the upzoning debates found in the literature review. Proponents of upzoning see the housing crisis as a supply and demand issue that is best solved through the market. If we can incentivize private developers to build more housing, rents will eventually fall and housing will be more affordable. One of the main barriers to building more housing is restrictive land use policies, such as single-family zoning. These policies have contributed to racial exclusion and segregation. Once we upzone, not only will the housing supply increase, it will create affordable housing opportunities for low-income tenants in previously exclusive neighborhoods. It will take the city many years to realize the benefits of upzoning, which will eventually outweigh the risk of displacement. They also don't believe that upzoning leads to displacement. They argue that displacement happens regardless of upzoning. On the other hand, critics of upzoning argue that upzoning enables private developers to amass massive profits that are disproportionate to community benefits. In other words, the city and community often give much more, for instance, in tax breaks than they get back. In practice, upzoning has not led to more affordability. Instead, the increase in land values and speculation that accompany upzoning leads to higher rents and displaces residents and small businesses. Rezonings have clear displacement impacts on communities of color, while whiter middle-class residents reap the benefits. Eviction is not the only mechanism through which residents are displaced from their communities. When the character of a neighborhood changes because of gentrification, it has a displacing effect on the community. Upzoning has certainly never been shown to stave off displacement. Next slide, please. For our case studies, we focused mostly on New York City because New York City was one of the earliest cities to upzone beginning in the 2000s and thus provides some evidence of the effects of upzoning. New York City is also a useful case study for Berkeley because New York City has strong rent control laws. We can see if, as many of the policy reports assume, rent control and other tenant protections can blunt the displacing effects of upzoning. As a brief overview, New York City was first rezoned on a large scale under the Bloomberg administration. Bloomberg upzoned 1/3 of the total landmass of the city through nearly 120 rezonings. Under Bloomberg, inclusionary housing was voluntary. Developers were given a density bonus if they agreed to produce affordable units. In 2015, the de Blasio administration proposed rezoning 15 neighborhoods as part of an effort to create or preserve 300,000 affordable housing units. The goal of the plan is not only to build more housing, but also to preserve existing affordable housing. Around the same time, the City Council approved a mandatory inclusionary housing rule. Under this rule, developers are required to produce a certain percentage of affordable units. In theory, de Blasio's plan seems much more equitable than Bloomberg's. But now let's take a look at some of the impacts of these policies. Next slide, please. Here's a map of the rezonings that happened under the Bloomberg administration. Unfortunately, under Bloomberg's voluntary inclusionary housing, many developers opted not to create affordable housing, and as a result, very little affordable housing was created. Only 2 neighborhoods produced most of the affordable units. Affordable housing accounted for 1.7% of the total residential growth in the city. Moreover, affordable units were not affordable to most New Yorkers. Most of the affordable units were set at 80% AMI. Next slide, please. I want to take a closer look at one of the neighborhood rezonings that took place. In 2008, the East Village and Lower East Side of Manhattan was rezoned. Under this rezoning, the wider and richer areas of the East Village and Lower East Side were contextually rezoned to preserve the established neighborhood scale and character. Contextual rezoning is a type of rezoning that tries to increase density without changing the look and character of the neighborhood. As a result, while taller buildings were not allowed to be built in the East Village, the areas with the highest percentages of Asian, Latinx, and Black residents were upzoned. This included parts of Chinatown. While the East Village was spared, most of the development was directed towards Chinatown. Already within the last few years before this upzoning, Chinatown has lost about 11,000 rent-regulated units, which represents a higher share than any other neighborhood in New York City, While these losses cannot be attributed to upzoning, upzoning did little to preserve affordability for an already vulnerable community. Upzoning, in fact, accelerated the displacement of low-income tenants. Contextual rezoning is a zoning concept that Berkeley City Council is seriously considering as it prepares the city's housing elements. As a general trend in New York City, wider, wealthier neighborhoods were contextually rezoned, while poor, Black, Brown, and immigrant communities were upzoned. Given what we saw in Chinatown, it would behoove us to pay closer attention to some of the inequitable impacts of contextual rezoning. Next slide. In theory, Mayor de Blasio's mandatory inclusionary zoning seems more equitable by mandating affordable housing. Yet there are many criticisms of the program. For one, even though mandatory inclusionary housing is a citywide policy, it only takes effect in neighborhoods that are upzoned. Even though the AMI is lower in voluntary inclusionary housing under certain options, the upper limit for other options goes much higher, up to 115% AMI. Whether it's voluntary or mandatory inclusionary housing, AMI levels often do not meet city needs. The greatest need for housing is 1/3 of the residents who make 30% of AMI. If the market is flooded with market rate apartments, then theoretically rents might go down, but never enough for low-income tenants. The demand for affordable units always outstrips supply. As a result, rents for low-income tenants never go down. In fact, even though the citywide vacancy rate is low at 3.9%, for low-cost rentals, the vacancy rate is practically zero, demonstrating the great need for affordable housing. Next slide. In both types of inclusionary housing, the production of affordable housing is always linked to the expansion of the luxury market. As a result, land values on rezoned land always rises dramatically, often ahead of the actual rezoning. For example, in East New York, speculators immediately started buying up land as soon as discussions on rezoning began 2 years before its passage. Home prices jumped 63% from $480,000 to $1.4 million. Meanwhile, median rent rose 16% to $1,850. Keep in mind that the median neighborhood income was $32,000. Next slide. Now, it's true there are different types of rezonings, and not all rezonings are created equal. Some types of upzoning produce more affordable units than others, as you can see from these different pie charts. Even though rezonings produce little affordable housing in relation to market rate housing, the authors of this policy report from the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development found that the ratio of affordable to market rate units matters in terms of displacement effects. A higher ratio is protective against displacement. This is because the drastic and disproportionate increase of market rate units floods neighborhoods with wealthier residents, which drives gentrification. Next slide. As you can see from this next slide, areas that were not rezoned were actually able to produce a higher ratio of affordable to market rate units. The question we have to ask is it possible to create more affordable units without simultaneously flooding the neighborhood with market rate rentals? Next slide, please. Looking at the case of New York City, did the market and upzoning create affordable housing and preserve housing stability? If we look at some general trends, the short answer is no. From 1994 to 2002, over 100,000 regulated units were lost citywide due to co-op and condo conversions, vacancy decontrol, buyouts, illegal evictions, and the expiration of tax benefits. Meanwhile, only 40,000 units of privately regulated apartments were added between 2003 to 2008, which represents only half the number of lost units. So the takeaway here is that the market simply cannot produce the amount of affordable housing needed to replace the numbers of rent-stabilized units lost. We may all be in agreement that New York City and Berkeley have a housing crisis, but the housing crisis for vulnerable low-income residents is much starker. As anyone who has ever tried to get an affordable unit through the housing lottery in New York City can tell you, it's nearly impossible to get one if you make less than 40% AMI. This is also why the preservation of affordable and rent-stabilized units must be a part of any goal to densify and integrate neighborhoods through housing production. As Tom Angotti, an expert on zoning in New York City, has pointed out, the premise that zoning can resolve the city's housing problems for the people who need it most is simply not true. Next slide. I spent quite a bit of time on New York City, but I want to turn briefly to the example of Chicago, which was recently upzoned in 2013 and 2015, mainly around several transit corridors. Researchers found that while there was an increase in land value and property transaction prices, there was no change in permit volume. This means that upzoning raised the cost of housing without actually producing more housing. Granted, these may be short-term effects since these upzonings happened within the last few years. The data is nevertheless concerning. Next slide, please. In our study, we wanted to find proven methods of achieving equity goals using upzoning. We didn't find much data to support the argument that upzoning increases affordability. Nevertheless, many cities are experimenting with different forms of upzoning with this goal in mind. We know that Berkeley City Council is now considering a 100% affordable overlay modeled after the overlay just passed in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The overlay was just passed recently, so there is not enough evidence to show how well it works, is working or not. Even though we don't have enough information to evaluate the effects of the overlay, we think it's still important to raise questions and concerns about it based on what we do know about upzoning. The purpose of Cambridge's 100% affordable overlay is to help affordable housing developers create affordable housing using public funds. By streamlining the process and creating more density for affordable developers, the hope is that developers can build more quickly and more cost-effectively. The concern remains whether the affordability requirement is affordable enough. Currently, 80% of the units will be affordable at 80% AMI and the remaining at 100% AMI. Next slide, please. Some of the newer case studies from other cities are important for us to look at because many of these cities, such as Minneapolis, Portland, and Sacramento, are explicitly trying to reform single-family zoning. Minneapolis has banned single-family zoning, a measure that Berkeley has also passed. Oakland is now researching the implications of allowing fourplexes on single-family lots. The rezoning that has taken place in these cities is likely what would be considered by City Council because the size and form of these cities bear more resemblance to Berkeley than New York City. But as I've mentioned before, these measures are recent and we have no evidence of their impacts yet. If Oakland and Berkeley want to consider fourplexes, the case of Portland would be an important to study further. Portland has legalized fourplexes on almost all lots and includes an affordability bonus for sixplexes at 60% AMI. Portland has also reduced the maximum FAR, or floor area ratio, for single-family homes while increasing the FAR for duplexes and fourplexes, a move that seems aimed at disincentivizing single-family homes. On especially large lots, there would be an actual requirement to build multiple units in future sales and demolition. Now we'll turn the presentation over to Sierra to discuss the upzoning case studies from Berkeley.
Thanks, Amy. So we're going to briefly discuss some case studies of upzoning that have actually historically happened in Berkeley. Part of this report will research and try to understand the impacts and implications that we're seeing today from those upzonings. There we go. So with the passage of the downtown and south side area plans, those neighborhoods were densified and experienced taller buildings in the neighborhoods. And so what we're really trying to look at here is understanding, 10 years out from 2011 and 2012, what is the data to support these upzonings, right? Whether it's additional development that's happened, and also what's at stake with affordability and maintenance of affordable housing. And so while the downtown and south side area plans both have their particularities and differ in the zoning type from what we're seeing now with very specific residential zoning in Berkeley, it does offer a really great opportunity for us to look at the locality and specifics of Berkeley and what some of your city needs might be. So just a brief overview of the plans. The Southside Area Plan passed in 2011. You can see here it's designated in blue. It's just south of the UC Berkeley campus, which I guess that's why it's called the Southside Area Plan. And they worked historically in very close contact with UC Berkeley to designate new densification for residential sub-areas. They also revised zoning regulations for the Telegraph Corridor, and this reduced parking requirements for that area and raised height limits on Telegraph. It also improved discretionary review process for projects that complied with zoning standards to try to fast track development in these areas. The Downtown Area Plan passed in 2012. You can see it designated in the dark purple square. It's just west of UC Berkeley's campus in District 4. The Downtown Area Plan encouraged high-rise development in the core area of up to 180 feet. And development in the outer core area of up to 120 feet. The outer core area was within half mile of downtown bars, so this can be considered upzoning near a transit hub. The downtown area encapsulated some residential single-family homes, although it did not upzone any of those single-family home areas. So what we're going to look at quickly is some data about the South Side area and downtown area plans using the same census demographic indicators as we've previously seen. So we can compare change over time in these areas in those demographics and also compare them to each other and compare them to the city as a whole. First, we're looking at renter occupancy. As we previously noted, there was actually a decrease in renter occupancy in areas around Berkeley over this time period. And we've done calculations to understand the average of these specific areas, as you can see here in this plot. So while the city of Berkeley's renter occupancy increased to nearly 4%, the downtown area plan section decreased by 0.21%, and the South Side area plan decreased by 0.47%. Median gross in the city, rent in the city of Berkeley increased by $600 per month during this time period. Downtown area plan increased by $572 per month, and rents in the Southside area increased by $658 per month. So the median home value in the city of Berkeley during 2009 to 2019 increased by $285,000. The downtown area plan households median value increased by $433,000, which is quite a lot higher than the city average. Unfortunately, there is not sufficient data to calculate the Southside area, but we are going to do further investigation and other data sources outside of the census. The median income during this time period in the city of Berkeley increased by almost $27,000. There's a much lower increase in median income in the downtown and south side areas during this time period. We speculate that has a lot to do with the student population. Rent burden households in the downtown and south side areas are actually quite opposite. As we mentioned, rent burden households in the city of Berkeley increased by 1.81% during this time period. We see in the downtown area during this time period, the rent burden households decreased by 13.98%, which is a huge amount. And we see that the south side area increased by 8.91%. So both of these areas are on the opposite sides of the city average. And we see poverty rate. The downtown area decreased in poverty rate by a little over 8%. The south side area increased in poverty rate by 7.5%. Meanwhile, the city of Berkeley during this time increased in poverty rate by 1.96%. Black, Indigenous, and people of color residents during this time period increased in the city of Berkeley by 13.29%. They also increased in both the downtown and south side area, downtown by 10.84% and south side by 15%. White populations in the city of Berkeley decreased by 7.59%, as we had previously seen. In the downtown area, they decreased more dramatically by 13%, and south side area decreased most dramatically, as we would expect based on the previous slide, by 15.54%. Latinx population during this time period increased in Berkeley by 9%. It decreased in downtown Berkeley by 4.59% and increased in the south side by just below average of 8.82%. And so, as I mentioned before, and I know I just kind of flew through those findings because I realized we're short on time. Those were, initial findings from the study, and we can't draw causal conclusions from that about the impact of upzoning from these data sets. But we do see some kind of interesting and alarming indicators of displacement, especially in the downtown area. And that we would say that in the downtown and south side area, the trends of this data do not align with the claims that upzoning policies alone maintain affordability and stem displacement. So much more research is needed to fully analyze and build a strong argument of the above statement. And in order to better understand what we're seeing, we're going to look at parcel level data about new developments in the downtown area plan and the south side area plan areas. We're also going to look at permit data showing demolition and the building of market rate and affordable units. And as I said, we're going to continue to explore the indicators we're seeing, especially in the downtown area. So we're going to move next to just some preliminary research about policy interventions. I'm going to pass that on to Amy to share about that, and then also bring us to the end of our presentation after that.
Thanks, Sierra. Can you move to the next slide, please? In the next phase of our research, we hope to study and hash out some policy recommendations. The list of considerations here is borrowed from policy initiatives, some proposed and some implemented found in our research. This is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, and we welcome any other suggestions from the board. As we found in our research, there is little evidence that private developers, even with public assistance, can produce the number of affordable units most needed by our residents. This is why the preservation of existing housing and reinforcing tenant protections are important policy measures to consider. Most of the policy recommendations we found on upzoning offer technocratic solutions on how to create more density and build more housing, focusing, for example, on floor area ratios, setbacks, parking requirements, height restrictions, etc. Very little has been recommended by way of tenant protections and anti-displacement measures. These are the policies that we would like to focus on. What measures can be complemented with upzoning to deliver the most equitable outcomes for tenants? These might include, for example, incentivizing the preservation of rent-regulated units, enacting and reinforcing protections against tenant harassment, including harassment caused by construction nuisances, mandating inclusionary housing that includes a higher percentage of very low income and extremely low income units, mandating displacement impact studies, much like the environmental impact studies currently required for all new developments. New York City has recently passed legislation to require a racial impact study on all rezoning. Consider the use of special overlays, such as the 100% affordable overlay currently under consideration by City Council, shoring up rental relief programs, mandating 100% affordable housing on publicly owned land, maximizing the land value capture on new developments to make sure the community receives benefits that are proportional to the profits developers make off new developments, supporting a community-led planning process so that we can plan according to what the community needs, not on what politicians and the market want, ensuring that affordable housing is permanently affordable. Next slide, please. In addition to researching these policy recommendations, we also hope to conduct more detailed analysis of specific upzoning policies considered in Berkeley. For instance, policies on inclusionary zoning, the expansion of ADUs, and the impact of state and regional upzoning policies. We also want to study how tenants are getting displaced in Berkeley. This may involve digging more deeply into the rent board data, looking at turnover rates and rent increases. Along with the parcel level data, this would help us further develop our Berkeley Vulnerability Index and consider which areas need further protection. We would conduct analysis of building permits to explore the impact of speculation in advance of upzoning. And finally, we would like to research construction budgets for various housing types to better understand expenditure breakdown in new construction and the actual cost of building affordable housing. Next slide, please. In conclusion, the debates on upzoning are varied and complex and don't simply boil down to a NIMBY versus YIMBY argument. This is certainly true in the Berkeley context. If it is the case, and this is a big if, that we cannot have more affordable housing without upzoning, then it is our belief that upzoning policies must be complemented with even more robust anti-displacement and tenant protections. Our review of the literature and case studies show that upzoning does not work to create housing stability for vulnerable tenants. Our initial findings demonstrate this is also true in Berkeley. It is not enough to state equity as an intended goal. Unless land use policies are created with equity as the primary goal and use proven methods to achieve that goal, upzoning will accelerate the displacement of Black, Brown, and low-income Berkeley residents, paradoxically intensifying the racist impacts of existing land use policies. Thank you all for listening to our presentation. We would love to elicit feedback and questions from the board now.
Thank you so much. We've got lots of hands up, so excited to hear what the different commissioners have to say and ask questions. I just wanted to, and I forgot to say this at the beginning, just to remind folks that this essentially, this is a kind of midpoint in the research. And so we do have an opportunity to still, shape what direction this might go. And that the anti-eviction mapping project will be providing back to the board a written report in February. So this is only really the beginning, but we wanted to get this started because we are in the middle of the housing element. And what's fantastic is now we will hear about the housing element after this. But I'm going to go ahead and start with the questions or comments. Commissioner Alpert or Vice Chair Alpert.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for all the work that you've done on this report. I was taking notes on some questions that I had, and you answered some of them before I could ask them, so that's always great to see. One specific question, I heard it, and I think I forgot, was the data you were looking at was from the 2018 community survey?
All right, I can answer that. So the data we were looking at in the initial maps and in the latter data analysis were taken from the community survey over time, actually. So we were looking at basically the change over time between the 2009 five-year community survey and the 2019 five-year community survey. So looking at that difference and adjusting for the population change.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, because I was going to suggest that there could have been a COVID impact on why there were lower renter populations that you saw in the South Side and downtown. But if COVID hadn't been impacting that data, then that wouldn't be an answer. Yeah, I'm kind of skeptical of the idea that there was a reduction in tenant percentage in the downtown and South Side. I don't know what's going on there, but that's definitely an interesting figure.
Yeah, we are skeptical too, and are definitely, that piqued our interest, and we're going to do some more research outside of the census to determine what's pushing that forward.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, that'll be great. I think that last bit about what policies you were going to look at was very exciting to see, and I think that's the direction we want to go in. Whether or not we would prefer upzoning to happen in the city, I think the political winds are pushing in that direction, and so I think the most productive use of your and our time is going to be on how we can best shape that in a way that will be beneficial for tenants and for low-income communities in Berkeley. And so I think generally speaking, there are kind of two different policy brackets. One is, what can we do to mitigate the impact? And then the second is, what can we do to extract the benefits, right? On the one hand, how do we stop the upzoning from increasing gentrification? On the other, how do we extract that new value that we're giving by increasing the value of the land to benefit those who need it the most? And I think you have a good mix of policies that are looking to that. One thing I'd encourage you to do when you're looking at vulnerability to displacement is that the South Side and downtown are not at all vulnerable to fourplexing because they're already denser than fourplex, right? So even if there are high, they obviously, changes in the conditions of nearby communities can impact them. But even if they're kind of score high on those rankings, they're not exactly as at risk because of the existing underlying zoning. One thing specifically that I was hoping you could look into, I didn't see it on the slide, and so I wanted to raise it here, was section 1954.52B of Costa-Hawkins. And so that is a provision in Costa-Hawkins that I became familiar with somewhat recently that allows, that says that an owner of a property can waive their right to an exemption from costs from rent control for a single-family home, or more importantly, new construction. They can waive their new construction exemption in exchange for a real financial benefit or a density waiver. And so, what I would hope that we could look at, and I don't know that I think this would be novel. I don't think this has been tried elsewhere in this state before. But if we can see how best we can condition the application of this upzoning on accepting a waiver of a new construction exemption, so that even those units that aren't affordable, right, we would still have some kind of an affordability requirement, but even those units that weren't affordable would still be rent controlled. right? And certainly my preference would be that they become rent controlled immediately. But there are even if the council doesn't have the appetite for that, there are also still steps they can take to say that they would become rent controlled after a certain period of time. Certainly, immediately would be best. And I think you guys hit this on the head, which is that upzoning will benefit people, right? Most principally, it will benefit those people who currently own land. Right? They're going to receive a significant increase in their and the value of their land by that upzoning. And then also, second, people who are going to benefit the most are going to be speculators who are well positioned to come into our community and purchase these homes for low value and then redevelop them and then flip them. And so in particular, one thing I was hoping that we could look at in terms of policies would be policies that specifically target or restrict that kind of speculatory flipping behavior, right? So that if someone wants to, they have their own home, they own their own home, and they want to fourplex it, okay. But if someone's going to come into our community, buy a property, fourplex it, and then sell it for massive gains, that's something that we want to both disincentivize and extract as much from as we can. Those are very predatory behavior, and it's one of the behaviors that's also going to drive significant displacement if we have folks coming into vulnerable African American communities in particular, where we have some long-term homeowners who may not be as savvy with the property. A lot of elderly folks, right, who own these homes, who may not realize how valuable they become because of the upzoning and can get predated upon by these kinds of behaviors. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. I guess one last thing is in your analysis about the upzoning of the south side and north side, one thing I didn't hear and I think would be interested to hear is increasing the density in the south side and north side doesn't necessarily just, you were analyzing it for what impacts it had on the south side and north side, but it's also possible, and I personally believe, that increasing density in the south side and downtown actually reduces displacement pressure in South and West Berkeley, specifically because of students, right? So what we know is that, for students in particular, their demand for housing is much more inelastic in Berkeley than other folks because they need to be a certain distance from campus. And so they're willing to pay much higher rates and live in much worse conditions because they need to be close to campus. And so the more housing that's available to them near campus, the less likely they are to compete with someone in, towards the southern part of Berkeley or towards West Berkeley as well. So that's just one other thing to consider. But overall, I was very pleased with all the reports, the direction going in, and I'm looking forward to seeing specifically those policy recommendations when you guys are prepared.
Great. Commissioner Laverde.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for that